has had for the last 40 years since we went into the EU is that we've had UK governments for whom fishing is just another piece on the chessboard. It doesn't matter to the UK economy, it's tiny for the UK economy. It's really important to Scotland, it's really important to this part of Scotland. We still have a viable industry here in a way that I don't think any other part of the UK still has a locally owned industry. And the English fleet's been decimated, they've got a lot of under 10s now, but they've got none of the kind of commercial fishing that you still get in the northeast of Scotland. Well, I think again, you know, I mentioned media bias when I was talking about this earlier, and I think, you know, clearly there are some vested interests who are, you know, feel that this debate shouldn't happen, but, you know, Scotland will only be represented well in international negotiations, whether inside or outside the EU, when we're speaking up for ourselves. And I think one of the other interesting things that hasn't really been talked about is that later this year, the system of majority voting in the European institutions is going to change, and it's actually going to privilege smaller nations. So smaller countries are going to have a stronger voice, relatively speaking, than they do at the moment in that process. And you know, Scotland has at the moment lands 2/3 of the UK's fish. You know, most of the UK fishing industry is the Scottish fishing industry, and yet Richard Lochhead, who's been our fishing minister for, well, since 2007, he is to sit behind the UK government in these talks, and he doesn't get to speak unless he gets their permission. And at important negotiations, they would rather have unelected peers who don't know anything about fishing speaking on behalf of them instead of Richard Lochhead. So instead of the revolving doors of UK ministers, none of whom have even a bit of coastline in their constituencies. That's maybe not fair in the current one, actually. He maybe has a wee bit of coastline. But, you know, we've had successive lists of people who really don't know anything about fishing, don't have any stake in the industry, negotiating on our behalf, and that's why we keep coming out with lousy deals. I think the other thing to say is that the levies that our fishing industry currently pay can't even be used to promote Scottish seafood. We've got fantastic seafood in this corner of Scotland, and we've got world-class produce, and yet we're not allowed to market it properly. And the levies that our industry pays should be spent on making the most of those products. And we also we miss out on the European Fisheries Fund as well. All that money that comes from Europe to support fishing communities, especially fishing communities that are changing and having to adapt in current circumstances. We're not getting our fair share of that money. You know, so the UK currently top slices our quota, top slices our EFF. You know, no wonder our fishing industry's been struggling. And yet I believe that it's an inherently sustainable, inherently strong industry and will bounce back. And, you know, it would be so much better served if we had our own voice in negotiations with other countries.
I agree 100%, like a lot of that goes to the fish, yeah.
You're just going to be a great ambassador for it.
Aye, we'll try.
Can I ask a question? I'm glad somebody asked the question of fishing, because fishing is at my heart. I was a fisherman all my life. I find it difficult to understand exactly where you're coming from with your explanation of how we're better off in the EU with fishing. In 2003, Alex Salmon desperately tried to withdraw from the CFP with a choose, after I guess vote, to pay money to join a corrupt European Union is beyond my belief. Because that's what we've got to do. We'll be a national contributor to the EU. In other words, we pay far much more money than we get from the EEF, as you were talking about. We may pay 5 million and get 3 million back, or 500 million and get 300 million back, and so on. That's the kind of comparison, as far as I know. Please allow me to continue, because I think
Yeah, you go.
talking skills like you. The most excited I ever heard Richard Lockhead speak. I mentioned his speech now, but unfortunately I missed it. But I was at a meeting in Peterhead a month or so ago, 6 weeks ago, where he spoke. And the question, the idea then was raised of what would it be like if Scotland was not in the EU? And it was the most exciting and energised I've ever heard Richard speaking. If we were in the same position as Norway, we could be able to do this, we could be able to do that, we could be able to do this and next thing. In the EU, you cannot, and you will not, because you are circled around by 28 other members. We have the resource, we have the continental shelf, and this is the resource in the continental shelf that the European folk want to fish on. And for us to get more, they have got to vote to take less. They'll never do it. They'll never accept less for themselves to give us more. They might suggest that they will. But in the end, as has happened several times already, ultimately the Scottish people lose out. Richard Lockhead tried desperately to get better situations for our Scottish fishermen and went to the government, to the EU, and said, we'll do this and do that the next year if you'll give us. And we did this, and they gave us next to nothing. And in the end, we were worse off than we were before. We got regional closure areas, 15 miles square. And earlier on this year, there was 11 regional time closures in our Scottish waters. Scottish boats weren't allowed to fish in them, because Richard had tried to get a better deal in Scotland. So we were this for corporate that we should. The English boats can fish in them, the foreign boats can fish in them, but the Scottish boats can't. And this is a deal that was brokered by the SNP.
I think what you have to, you make a lot of really good points, but most of them are to do with whether an independent Scotland is in the EC or not, and I think that's the case that's for an independent Scottish government to decide sometime in the future.
Well, can I just finish? If the Scottish government is at this time, we'll say we're going to have a yes vote, and then have a referendum as to whether or not we would go to Europe, I can understand it. But you're not even suggesting that we get a chance to say yes or no to Europe. You're saying Europe is the best place for us. You don't know anything about it. Europe is, we know, but you don't know. And we're going to take into Europe regardless. And I have to put Alexander did, but Richard Lockhead said they're going against the word. They said one thing, and then they're going to do another.
Okay, I think we'll let the panel answer.
Can I say thank you very much for raising the issue, because I know it's a very fraught one. I mean, I'm a Macduffer. I grew up in Macduff, and Macduff Harbour is as sad in some respects as any of the harbours around our coast, and there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that common fisheries policy has been an absolute disaster. It's been a disaster in environmental terms, it's been a disaster in economic terms, and in terms of the social fabric of the communities around the North East Coast, it's just been hopeless. So, we can't turn back the clock on that. However, I do think, even though we wouldn't want to start from here, this is not where we would want to be, I do think that the reforms that have been made to the common fisheries policy in the recent round of negotiations, the regionalisation of the CFP, is a huge step forward and a step change, both in terms of ensuring that member states in this fishing basin will have a say over what goes on in that basin, but also that fishermen for the first time will be actively involved in that process. So it's not perfect, and I don't think it's some sort of panacea for the fishing industry, but it's certainly a big step forward. in terms of Scotland's position in the EU, again, I think going back to what Stewart was saying earlier, we will not be outside the EU. Even if we voted to leave the EU tomorrow, we would not be outside the EU for several years because it just doesn't work like that. We would have to negotiate our way out, and part of those negotiations would undoubtedly be access to fishing waters, because people have enjoyed access for some years now because of that sellout by the Tories in the 1970s. And we can't just turn the clock back on that, much as I'm sure we could all get very animated at that prospect. But I think in terms of the current industry, we need to see it in quite a balanced way, because one of the things that I'm very aware of is that this is not just about the catching sector, it's also about the processing sector. And so many of the fishing industry, so much of the fishing industry in the North East now is exporting fish to the EU. So our market is significantly situated in other parts of the EU and further afield as well. But putting up barriers to those markets would add costs and cost jobs in our fishing sector. We also have problems in a lot of the North East recruiting people into the fish processing sector. We've had a huge wave of immigration over recent years of people coming here to work in jobs that otherwise just would not be filled. And if that was happening, people wouldn't be able to land their fish in our ports. They would be landing it in other ports where there is a factory that can process it. So, there have been pros and cons of being part of the EU in the current situation. And I take on board your point about what we contribute and get back from the EU, but what's missing from that equation is the benefit that private sector businesses get from being part of the EU. And it's not just the fishing industry, but certainly the fishing industry also gains benefits from having that access to a market of millions of people and people to actually buy and sell their products on a free trade basis. Now, I'm not going to stand and be an apologist for the EU in any sense. Indeed, I was being quite critical of EU yesterday in Westminster. But I think we have to be realistic about the legal position we're in. And lastly, there's nothing to stop. If we're an independent country, we can have that debate. There's nothing to stop people in Scotland having that debate about whether they want to be part of the EU or not in the longer term. I have my view on it. I'm sure other people will have different views. But just as we've had this debate about Scotland's future in a civilised and discursive way, I hope we can have that debate in a civilised way too. Not the debate that we're seeing in parts of the UK at the moment, which is all about hating foreigners and this nasty xenophobic, jingoistic, horrible debate that's going on at the moment that we've seen during the European elections. So, if we're going to have the debate and talk about the benefits, the pros and cons, let's do that in a balanced way that looks at both sides of the equation, but let's not do it just by trying to get rid of all the foreign people who come to live here and work.
Do you want to say something first? I would just say a very simple thing, because I like simple arguments. It's just the way I am. That at the point we are sitting down with the EU, they've got a simple choice, and it isn't the choice that perhaps has been characterised. The choice is between accommodating our interests in fishing and a wide range of other subjects in exchange for something that they have to give us. I mean, we've got most of Europe's oil, we've got a huge proportion of Europe's renewable energy industry, things that matter to Europe, and a lot of the fishing assets. And at the end of the day, the choice is not between what Europe currently gets from Scotland and our taking it all away. The choice is between our taking it all away and they're getting something that suits us. In other words, getting less. It's perfectly correct that if you read the protocols, in particular you look at Schedule 2 and Schedule 3, that you have, right at the beginning, you have to accept all this. But if you actually look at what happens in practice, for example, when East Germany came in, then you find that Europe is pragmatic. And the reason Europe has to be pragmatic and can't rely on the rules is because there actually are no rules governing an independent country emerging from a country that's already a member. So therefore, you start in many respects with a blank sheet of paper. And because we own so many aces, you know, the assets, the things that matter to you in fishing, in oil, in gas, in energy, I think it would be a very incompetent set of negotiators that didn't get a deal incomparably better than the one we currently get.
I think as well, just from my point of view, food and drink is Scotland's biggest exports. You know, it's not oil or anything else. Food and drink is Scotland's biggest export, and it all boils down to who do you trust best to look after that. A Westminster government who's got a track record of selling the fishing industry down the tubes, or a Scottish government. So if you would like to discuss afterwards, you know, I want to give everyone a chance to ask any questions. If you'd like to discuss with Eilidh or Stewart afterwards, I'm sure they'd be willing to.
If there are any questions, I'd like to respond.
Okay, sure.
I work within the financial services sector as an independent financial advisor, directly authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. In your white paper, you state that Scotland will set up their own financial conduct authority.
Yeah.
Have you been in has the SNP been in talks with the FCA to find out whether or not they will migrate their regulations into Scotland? If so, do you know what the cost is going to be and who will meet that cost? And currently, if I try to go out to the UK to take a French product, I have to hold a special passport to enable me to get to their products. Will that be the case of an independent Scotland for me to go back into England?
Very detailed question.
I'll do it without the mic if I may. Right, well, it's quite a complex set of questions. How much will it cost to set up a regulatory structure for Scotland? Well, first thing to say is, of course, that we already own 8.5%, 8.6% of the regulatory structure that exists. Yes, we do.
In where?
The FCA, we own 8.6% of it today, and would still own it on the first day of independence, if nothing else is happened.
What capacity do you own? 8.5% of the FCA?
The Vienna Convention on Successor States, which governs how the assets and liabilities of states that emerge, multiple states that emerge from a predecessor single state. And it's already been used in international law. So it's not, you know, we're not talking novelty here. So we already pay for, and in consequence of that, own part of the FCA. Now, owning 8.6% of the FCA is sort of one thing. So you've got a starting, that's the starting point. It's not the ending point. So therefore, you're not starting on a blank sheet of paper. And that's true across a whole range of different bodies that we might have to have. Incidentally, the UK government's paper 2 weeks ago, was it? It suggested we had to have, was it 400 or 600? Do you know, it was some fantasy number anyway. They suggested it would be 1.5 billion. And relied on a couple of university economists who totally rubbished it. In one case, he said it would cost nothing, and in the other case, it would cost 150 million for everything, by the way, the FCA. Right. The second thing that's in the Vienna Convention on Successor States that's quite important is in relation to treaties. And whether you like it or not, the successor states inherit all the treaty obligations and rights of the predecessor state. So therefore, all the bilateral negotiations that exist between the UK and others exist the day after, in the first day of independence, unless you choose to do something to change that. But you'd actually have to proactively make those changes, rather than... So you actually inherit that under the Vienna Convention. There are two Vienna Conventions on successor states, just in case you go and look, so if you want to go and look at them both. So we've got that legal instrument that provides that continuity. It's worth saying, and you will know because you're in the industry, and while I did work for 30 years in a bank, I did so not as a banker, so I'm not going to make extravagant claims about detailed knowledge. Although if my wife was here, she worked in stockbroking and could do. That we already trade internationally. You've given the examples. I wasn't aware of the specific one you've given, and I will go away and next time somebody asks me the question, I'll be better informed because I'll have gone away and had a look at that. But we certainly have the free movement of capital and goods in Europe, with the caveat, and it's a caveat that people are not often aware of, that when you take money across borders in the EU, if it exceeds, I think, 50,000 euros, you need to declare it to customs. They can't stop you taking it across the border, but you have to declare it so the movement of money is actually tracked. And I know that because one of my constituents fell foul of that and ended up in French jail for a week until I got them out. It was accidental, you know, it wasn't anybody who was at it, one way or another. So I think from that point of view, we've got a good starting point with a legal basis for continuity, and then we decide how we want to structure the supervision. I mean, I think when Gordon Brown did two things in 1967, he changed the basis of advanced corporation tax for pension funds, which essentially changed the way in which capital gains worked in pension funds, which took 5 billion a year out of pension funds. Then is now taking 10 billion a year out, because you could defer paying the capital gains until you paid out the money, so you didn't pay any trades. But the other one, which was actually a more fundamentally difficult thing to have done, and I don't necessarily claim hindsight, you know, I might have done it too, but he took the oversight of the financial services industry, in banks in particular, out of the hands of the Bank of England, who had considerable expertise in doing it, and gave it to the then Financial Services Authority, the predecessor to the FCA. And that was disastrous because they didn't have the knowledge to do it. They separated the... Sorry?
They still don't.
Well, I can't say that, but I have heard others like you say that they don't, although we've now got a decent chairman in place who's, what's his name, used to be the climate change board, Lord, who's the... It's Adair Turner, Lord Adair Turner, well done. I'm glad he came. Have you got a script? And if anybody can fix it, Adair can, but it may be beyond fixing.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think one of the things that we've said very clearly is we want to have as much continuity as we possibly can around the regulation of financial services, but I agree entirely with you. I think the regulatory system in the UK has fallen very far short of what it needs to be, and I'm not confident. I say this as a constituency MP who's had to deal with many cases for individuals, that really the regulatory system isn't working as well as it needs to, because when people have problems, they just find that they can't really resolve them. And you know, we've seen it with Equitable Life people, we've seen it with a whole range of other financial institutions, that the regulator's been kind of toothless, and we need to have better regulation, and I don't think that's something we can fix overnight, but in the longer term I think it's something that will be very much in Scotland's interest to get right, given that financial services is such an intrinsic part of our economy, particularly in the Lothian region.
So have the SNP been in talks with the FCA?
I've certainly not been in talks with the FCA, but I don't know if Stewart knows if that's, has John Swinney been?
It's worth saying there have been a whole series of informal talks with a lot of people, but the UK government is actually refusing to allow formal talks to take place. So therefore, any of the discussions that have taken place, which are of a more informal nature, have been to explore the options rather than reach conclusions. I wouldn't want to, you know, take you too far down the line that you're trying to drag me.
And I would just add, I work in a business that's already devolved. Housing and planning are devolved matters, and you're obviously in an industry that's not. I think it's a great advantage because if we've got a problem, I'm talking to someone in Edinburgh, you know, as part of the industry body, it's a lot easier to get access. You know, it's a lot easier to lobby. You tell them, you know, this is not, I'm not a member of the SNP, but they seem to listen to what you say. The regulations and so on that come out afterwards tend to reflect, you know, we don't get everything we want, obviously, but they tend to reflect you know, what the trend of what you're saying. You know, I've never lobbied anyone in Westminster. Why would I bother? You know, we only have one Tory MP in Scotland, so you know they're not interested, basically. But it's different in Hollywood, definitely. Well, that's just my impression. So, any other questions?
Can I make just one point? We want independence so we can remove ourselves, correct? Okay, so we want independence so we can be removed by the party we want up here, correct? Yet you want to take us into Europe, who's ruled by deprecants and hypocrites who've never even been voted in, and you still want to take us into Europe?
It's worth just exploring the nature of the UK. The UK has 1,442 parliamentarians. That is the second biggest parliament in the entire world. The biggest parliament in the entire world is the Chinese People's Republic. Even the United States manages to get by with 450. And the UK Parliament, the majority of the UK Parliament is unelected and cannot be dismissed. Cannot be dismissed. There are 822 people in the House of Lords who cannot be dismissed. There are 799 of them currently active. There are 23 not active. So, you know, there's a lot of room for manoeuvre there, but there's only 650 of the total parliamentarians elected. In Europe, under the process of co-decision making, the small number of commissioners, about 5% as a share of the number of parliamentarians, have to share responsibility with the elected parliamentarians for the decisions Parliament makes. So, by the argument you deploy, Europe is substantially more democratic than the UK. Now, I make that argument for effect, because of course it's not quite that simple. But, and I think this is really the real important point is, would an independent Scotland be like every other country in the world and share its sovereignty with chosen partners? And every other country in the world does precisely that. In defence, we've got 33 members of NATO, approximately 30. I'm not getting any nods or shake the head. I think it's 33 members of NATO. So we share sovereignty in NATO on matters of defence, because we want to be a member of a club where we can support each other. The European Union is another case of where we share sovereignty. We share jurisdictions under the European Convention on Human Rights. Nothing to do with the EU. The UK has been a member of that since 1954. And that's a bigger family of people that we share sovereignty with in that kind of jurisdiction. And countries all around the world, even North Korea, the most isolationist country in the entire world, now shares some sovereignty, and you actually have economic migrants even commuting daily into China. That's about the only bit of sharing we've got. And Albania, of course, used to be totally isolated. So I think at the end of the day, it's having the power to choose the partnerships that you enter into, and having the power to manage those terms and to cut them off again if they're not working for you. And that's what independence in the modern world is about, and that is the independence for which I'm campaigning. Now, let me be fair, of course, the people on the yes side of this argument represent different strands of opinion. I'm speaking as an SNP politician in many of the things I say. But we are all united around the idea, whatever our diverse political viewpoints, that having the sovereignty and having control of the sovereignty is the prerequisite to then deciding how you're going to share it. And that's what we're voting for on the 18th of September.
Am I allowed a second one?
Sure.
I'm looking for a bit of advice, actually. Yesterday I had a couple visits. As we got out of the car, they spotted my A3 yes posters on the side of the shed. And it immediately started a conversation. And the point that they put to me was, at the moment, as we know, we are very remote here from Westminster, as is the north of England and Cornwall, you know, the southwest. The argument put to me was and I'm asking for advice as to how best to reply to that. With an independent Scotland, and we're governed fully from Edinburgh, are people in Wick and the Western Isles going to feel similarly remote, or do you think that a Scottish Government would properly service the whole country?
I think Sandy just answered your question a couple of minutes ago. As a businessman based up here who has to deal for his business with politicians, he finds, Holyrood 100% more accessible. And, certainly my experience for voluntary sector organisations, before I was a politician, I worked in the third sector, and certainly the experience of working with governments in Holyrood was totally different because the door was open. You didn't have to bang at the door to get in. You didn't have to subscribe to a set agenda. We've got one of the most accessible systems of democracy anywhere in Western Europe now, with the committee system, the petition system. Any single person in this room can take a petition to the Scottish Parliament on any issue they see fit. And that kind of participative democracy, I think, can always grow and improve, and I hope we will, but we're on that journey. And I think the 18th of September allows us to complete the powers and actually have more powers at our disposal to be able to bring that kind of accountability to our governance.
Can I just say just a couple of wee things on that? One, next week the Local Government and Regeneration Committee of the Scottish Parliament will be considering a paper which is about the powers of local government after independence, because on Independence Day powers come north, and the assumption is they won't all come to the Parliament. They'll bypass the Parliament and go straight to local authorities. And one of the things that comes with independence is an opportunity to reinvigorate and re-empower local authorities, because we're not intending to increase the size of the Scottish Parliament, if only for the very simple reason we don't have any spare offices or any seats in the chamber for additional members to sit. So that's one thing to think about. And the other one was just the way the Parliament works. Power is more dispersed. In the Scottish Parliament, for example, the committees of the Parliament can initiate and take forward legislation. Can't do that at Westminster. Committees at Westminster can't do that. And furthermore, private members only get to take bills through by lottery. Whereas in the Scottish Parliament, in each session of Parliament, that's a 4-year period, members can bring forward 2 bills if they wish to do so. They don't have to go in a lottery. So much more, if you want something to be done, you just go and find somebody and take a bill forward. It sounds very easy when I say it as quickly as that. It's not really, it's quite a lot of work.
And my answer is, in the last government, before the present one, which was a minority SNP government, there were 6 members of the cabinet. 3 of them came from the northeast of Scotland: Alex Salmon, Richard Lockhead, and Stewart. When I speak in a lot of business meetings, and when I speak in Edinburgh, they're scared that Glasgow calls the shots. When I speak in Glasgow, they're scared that everything's going to go to Edinburgh. And then when I go to Perth, they say, well, it's all going to be controlled by the Central Belt. And I'm thinking, well, Perth is the Central Belt to me, coming from the north. So, you get different questions, but, it seems to be fairly spread out.
Okay, thank you.
Is it time for tea?
We've got a new one. Yeah.
I appreciate the optimism that's on show here. It's nice to see something positive. However, I'm a realist, and I might even fit into your boxes a bit of a political pessimist. So, but I just after a yes vote, I would like to know from